The Georgetown Conservation and Development Corporation public-private partnership business model at Fort Cornwallis has two branches. One is geared towards the management and operations of the fort, while the other focuses on conservation and restoration works, carried out by ThinkCity Sdn Bhd with technical input from Aga Khan Trust for Culture. The trust was approached by ThinkCity after Georgetown was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2008 to help establish a management plan for the site. It also extends its technical expertise and advice, not just for the fort, but also for other heritage and cultural initiatives in Penang. Based on its assessment sometime in 2014, the Trust put together a conservation management plan for Georgetown and one specifically for Fort Cornwallis.
Based on that, we recommended a number of measures that should be undertaken, some of which related to restoration, but other also related to better ways of presenting this important heritage building. It must be underlined that this is the first building that was built in Georgetown. Clearly, it has a special significance for the town and was the first, in fact, brick building that was built. And to this day, it remains paramount to understand the history of the town.
There are many levels of best practices in conservation itself, but the conservation team at Fort Cornwallis focuses on two main principles. The first is a conservation of the place itself, and the second is on how best to present values of the place to the public. There are many spaces of significance in the fort, but decision was made to commence the first phase of restoration works at the 10 storerooms, as these were the oldest structures at the site. The budget for conservation works at the fort is dispersed by the state government in tranches, including $150,000 for restoration of the rooms. The spaces within these storerooms are now earmarked for museological displays. The second phase of the fort's presentation is the reinstatement of the moat that used to surround the fort. This has passed the approval stage and is now going through a tender process. The aim is to complete the reinstallation of the moat by 2023.
The previous concessionaire is no longer there, and this would be a good moment to consider how best to organize the next phase of the project. It needs a single management that extends to the entire area and that is well organized both in terms of daily operations but also in terms of long-term vision. And this is extremely necessary to avoid that the place is overused or underused or poorly managed and poorly maintained. This is an essential component of any heritage management plan.
Conservation of the 10 storerooms at the fort progressed steadily, but stopped shortly in December 2020 to facilitate the formulation of a more efficient and transparent procurement process, which eliminated lengthy procedures and bureaucratic hurdles. Despite delays and challenges arising from lockdowns due to the COVID-19 global pandemic through 2020 and 2021, the 10 storerooms were completed in July 2022. The experimental approach introduced was effective in establishing innovative conservation techniques that supported best practices coherent with conservation principles in a historic urban landscape like Georgetown.
Pilot restoration effort at the storage room began toward the end of 2017. Undertaken in conservation and restoration activity, it is important to find the right intervention methodology based on study and identify the typology of the structure, knowledge of materials that form the environment in which it is located, the historical periods in which it was carried out, and the restoration that have occurred over time.
This information is sometimes available in historical archives and documents. However, no such records were found for Fort Cornwallis. In the absence of this, a technical and scientific committee was formed to conduct physical studies and analysis of the structure to determine the components that form it, the alterations that occurred over time, and the cause of deterioration and degradation, including large areas of biological agents that made the internal and external environments of the rooms unhealthy. Among recommendations of the committee was to use techniques appropriate to the building and its history, and to utilize local materials instead of cement. This resulted in considerable advancements in resolving rising damp issues and brickwork preservation.
The phenomenon of rising damp on the vertical walls of historic or modern building is common everywhere. This is caused by the presence of water originating from soil, which changes over time based on natural atmospheric and seasonal factors. It is known that this phenomenon is amplified and prevalent on surface due to the techniques and materials with which the building was built.
There are various remedies to stabilize this phenomenon. One option is the dry technique, which combines shapeless blocks of granite without mortar. And the other remedy was the creation of breathable plasters that is extremely resistant to moisture, composed of active aggregates like pozzolana, brick powder, and metakaolin, and inactive aggregates such as siliceous sand and lime putty as a binder. This type of mortar has hydraulic properties that does not require oxygen to harden. It can harden in water and be treated with oils and waxes to make it waterproof. It is also recyclable, resistant to rising damp, elastic, and breathable, thus regulating humidity in the rooms. The alkaline binder also gives the mortar fungicidal and disinfectant properties. The new lime and metakaolin mixture, created explicitly for the structures at Fort Cornwallis, were applied to the walls after careful cleaning and removal of previous layers. Interesting discoveries were made following removal of the layers. 4 of the storerooms, damaged by American bombs during World War II, were entirely rebuilt by the Japanese using cement, while in 6 of the remaining rooms, removal of the cement mortar revealed that the arched openings had been modified.
The reconstruction of the arches was carried out using terracotta bricks and hydraulic mortars, and technical and material aspects like the original in composition and techniques. Looking at the arches, however, you can see a difference in the type of bricks and size and colors. This is one of the fundamental aspects when operating on an historical building. Little clues and difference in materials and techniques made it possible to identify the different transformation and phases of construction.
One of the crucial restoration works at the fort were efforts to stabilize the exterior and interior walls and barrel vaults. To resolve this, semi-liquid dough, prepared on site using active aggregates such as brick powder and metakaolin, combined with lime putty and water, were filled into syringes and injected into cracks in the original structure to consolidate, reinforce, and stabilize the building. Restoration works on flooring in the fort storerooms posed a challenge because removal of the layer of flooring during previous restorations resulted in transpiration and rising damp issues. This promoted the growth of biological agents in the internal surface of the structure, which could not be fully eliminated with biocide.
After testing, we realized that only a small part of the original bricks that made up the flooring could be reused, running the risk of creating a floor that was no longer true to its original appearance. It was therefore decided to maintain and preserve the original floor, creating a new layer of flooring. The new flooring is built on several levels, having a layer of narrow pave, which consists of light but at the same time robust modules, which create an air chambers to curb the rise of moisture and also act as a protection of the original surface of the floor. Then we made the underflooring electrical system so as not to disturb the original vertical surface. Over it we added a layer of gravel to cover the entire electrical system and then started the application of the terrazzo flooring.
Specific research was done to ensure that the restoration of fittings like doors to the storerooms would harmonize the fort's historical context, since only the perimeter shape correlating with the perimeter shape of the arches was evident. With this, a design model that was as similar as possible to the original doors was prepared. Each door was made and assembled on site by local carpenters to custom fit the arched openings. The restoration also focused on making the fort a space that was safe, comfortable, and accessible to people from all walks of life. This included ensuring that there are ramps for wheelchairs and safe walking paths for visitors, in addition to outdoor spaces sheltered from the sun. The conservation team at Fort Cornwallis faced a multitude of challenges, but among the major ones was the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. Amplified during this period was the overdependence on foreign labour to carry out works on conservation sites like Fort Cornwallis. Only a small percentage of labour knew in part the mortar application technique. However, many preferred to return back to their countries and family during the pandemic, taking with them the skills and knowledge acquired. Despite the setbacks, most of the goals put in place by the technical and scientific committee were achieved.
One of the main goals of the committee was to develop materials that were mainly made up of local materials, so that everyone can use them in the future, which were sustainable and recycled materials. The goals listed can be said to have been successfully achieved, and above all we can say that they work since some of the rooms were finished before the pandemic and despite having been unattended during the lockdown periods.
Archaeological excavations at Fort Cornwallis are being carried out by University Science Malaysia's Centre for Global Archaeological Research. The centre was engaged by ThinkCity to carry out excavations and uncover the fort's moat structure. This marked the commencement of restoration and conservation work at Fort Cornwallis, with emphasis and focus on upholding best practices, documentation, training, transfer of knowledge, public engagement, and community participation programs, such as the Young Archaeologist Program.
Our task is to record and document archaeological evidence within the compound of the Fort Cornwallis, and we work hand in hand with the conservators from the Aga Khan Institute as well as ThinkCity, other partners as well. The funding, we got it from the state government through CMI, Chief Minister Incorporated, and this is quite beneficial because it shows that the state government really cares about the site, and this funding permits and helps us to do research on site, and it's also beneficial to not just the research but also towards the conservation and preservation of the site in the long run. So in terms of that kind of funding, it helps a lot in the research aspect as well as in the management of the sites. When we started doing excavation works, we also think of the communities within the fort and how these archaeological works can benefit them. So we started to devise a program called Young Archaeologist Program that involves mostly the school children. We approach few schools that is close to the site. One of it is Hatching School. And then we got school children that age from 8 up till 17 years old to come and join us in a dig. We allocated a space for them. It's a real archaeological site, archaeological trench, and they did help us in digging. They found lots of interesting artifacts. At the same time, they learned on not just the history of the fort, but on how to do archaeology. The parents also joined in, and apparently the parents enjoy it as much as the kids, you know. And it becomes a success because apart from doing all those works, we also learning from them in terms of how they look at the fort history, how they look at the artifacts, their interpretation. So it's always a two-way learning between us and the public. It's always part of our philosophy to involve the locals because we believe in the bottom-up approach. Not just in terms of the knowledge, but as well as the development of the site. We believe that the biggest stakeholders of any sites or historical sites are the locals themselves. We think that they should have a say. The top-down approach where certain agencies, government agencies says that you have to do this and that, is not really relevant nowadays. You have to include the locals and let them have a say on what is the best way to manage and what's the best way to interpret the sites, apart from having other agencies and other researchers in terms of creating that definition of sites.
The Fort Cornwallis Conservation and Restoration Project achieved many successes. These include winning results from collaborations with project partners, the formulation of functional products that are eco-sustainable and recyclable using local materials like the lime putty and metakaolin mortar mix, workforce education on suitable restoration materials and techniques, and the creation of alternative and innovative construction methods. Phase 1 of the restoration of Fort Cornwallis has been completed, and the team is now moving on to the second phase, which is the excavation, reinforcement, and filling of the moat surrounding the fort.